Hey everybody, welcome back to the Book of Lying. So I had a few ideas on what I would make this next video on, but it occurred to me not everyone is as familiar with these blocks as I am, so it will probably behoove me to actually explain what the differences are and all the different facets of how these things work. So, to get started, do not worry about this, it's just a little highlighter, we have impulse, chain, and repeat. Very straightforward. More or less they do what they say on the tin, but specifically we'll start off with the impulse. So this particular one is the closest to how command blocks originally functioned, in that it contains a command, and when it gets a signal, it will do something. So, for example, here's one I prepared earlier, just plays us a sound. There we go. And it will do that every time it gets a signal, and you can pulse signals through them, you can get an output from them using a comparator to determine whether or not they succeeded. In this case, of course, yes, but in other cases, if we do that one, not yet. Yeah. So, very straightforward and simple. It has gained some abilities by virtue of the update that added these two, but I'll get into those in a little moment. So then we have chain. Now, chain is unusual in the course of these three because it's actually not meant to be used in isolation. Both repeat and impulse can be used on their own, but chain has to have a precursor. So, for example, if we get our command here, and we add our chain, now if we add a signal to chain, it doesn't do anything, but if we add a signal to our impulse, we can see it then triggers. So chains require that the command block directly behind them go off or receive some kind of update pulse in order to actually fire. Now, that means that basically you can use chains to massively condense your lines of commands. So whereas previously, with just impulses, you had to basically put them together in sort of like that fashion, just chain them together with redstone, or alternatively have them in a big block that you then triggered. Using a chain, you can just have one and then a line of them. Now, there are some limitations to how that works, so for example, if I do something a bit like this, we can see exactly the limits of how this works. So we only managed to trigger this one, even though it is actually getting the signal behind it. What happens basically is that they have to be looking at one where the arrow of that particular one is going directly into it. So if we put one here, we'll notice we have similar problems. There we go. So it managed to go all the way in because the arrow is pointing that way, so we can cause it to loop around in a much more dense fashion, like so. So give that a shot. There we go, that is all of them, and that allows you to make some very, very compact circuits. So keep that in mind when you're doing your stuff, but do beware of exactly how it has to work. That arrow has to be pointed into the next chain block. It doesn't necessarily have to have like lining up with the back one, but it does have to be pointing into it. So, that then brings us to repeat. Now, previously, when you wanted to use a command block, you had to have a big clock going. So, common ideas where people just had inverters, which are made out of redstone torches going into each other in odd numbers, or they had hoppers going around, or they used any number of other ways to create a regular signal in redstone. Repeat, on the other hand, completely does away with that by incorporating its own timer inside. So, as long as a repeat command block is active, it triggers on every single tick in-game. Now, depending on how your server is performing, that can be up to 20 usually. So, 20 times per tick, a repeat block will go off. So here we have it, providing these particles every single tick. Pretty straightforward. So, that is the basics. Now, there's a bit more that we can do here. So, if we look into, well, let's look into this one. We have the first question here of conditional or unconditional. This applies mostly to these chain blocks, but what it means is that, you remember that little comparative signal that we were getting there, out of this particular block here? If I do that again, we see we've got a signal coming out. And that particular signal, usually, in some cases it varies a little bit, but in most cases for a command block, that means, was I able to successfully do the last command? So if I change this to be test4 at A in, say, a range of 2 blocks. So it hasn't fired yet, so it doesn't know about anything. If I do that, it hasn't done anything. If I get closer, it's detected me. Now, if I use a chain command block and set it to conditional, you can see it's got that little change in effect. So, nothing there, nothing there, and now I'm close enough. So, this has some distinct limits that you do need to know. So currently, this is, if there's a player within 2 blocks, then we fire a firework. Straightforward. If we want to fire 2 fireworks, though, we can see that there's a problem. Because you see, I'm way, way away, and we only got the 1 firework. The reason is that each individual chain is only looking at the block directly behind it. They have no concept of the conditionality, if you want to call it that, of the overall flow. So this particular one doesn't care. This only cares about conditionality if it is looking at this one and this one managed to fire, which, to its credit, is dependent upon that one actually getting a signal. But in a lot of cases, this can be really problematic when you're trying to build actual lines of code, if you will. Now, an additional problem is I have no way of inverting this. So in standard programming, what you have is true and false. And in this case, all we have access to is true. Because if the answer to this one is false, if I'm too far away, nothing gets sent down the line. There's no test for whether that worked or not, just whether it worked. So that is something that you can get around in some delicate ways that I've done on Spring Realms, which I might talk about in a later episode, but do beware of that. So, the third and final value that we need to be aware of with these 3 blocks is needs redstone or always active. Now, in the case of repeat, you almost don't need to care about it in regards to impulse. In the case of repeat blocks, usually people will want to have it on always active, but in a lot of cases I find it's better to keep them on needs redstone because they can be a little bit unreliable, and if something does go wrong, you can just run a command to replace the redstone that's happening to be triggering it with something like stained glass. That's what I do with the bedrock box on Spring Realms, with an emergency panic button. Which has saved our bacon on a few cases, so bear that in mind. But what it basically means is, when I get a signal, like, do I do things, or do I actually have to be powered by redstone? In the case of an impulse, it pretty much only cares about being on needs redstone. Doesn't do a thing otherwise. In the case of repeat, you can set it to be needs redstone, and it will only do it when it has an actual pulse. So let's just compare. So here we have always active, it plays once, doesn't do a thing after that. Here we have our little particle effect, it'll do that just fine as well. But the thing that this is actually most useful for is the chain, because what this allows you to do is add additional redstone controls into your command block line that are like things that you can turn off. They might be signals from a locking mechanism elsewhere in your build. They might be an additional check for something. So let's just build ourselves a little test here, shall we? So first let's get ourselves a test 4, and we want to go with just that little detector. Let's send that out to here. We'll set this to always active, so it's now always detecting me. And let's have another up here that's just doing our little particle effect. We'll put that on one on needs redstone, just as demonstration that we can. And this is where things get a little noisy. So let's shuffle that a little bit to there. Okay, and we'll put this block here. We want it to be on needs redstone. And same issue there is that it also only applies to that particular block, but you can extend that out a bit more. So now I have the particles, and if I get close enough, then it does that. Now, there's a bunch of different ways that we could do this particular example. I'm not going to, like, tell you that that is clearly the best way to do that. This is just an example to show you how these things work. But basically, the way that you are going to use these is chains will always follow after an impulse or a repeat. And then a repeat is where you want to be checking for something constantly, whereas an impulse is when something happens, such as a button press. Although you can also create remote control buttons by having repeats look for specific block states. it's an option. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed. That hopefully illuminates you a bit more on just what these 3 different colours of block mean. And I shall catch you all next time. Toodles.